more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Rev Don. Welcome, and I hope you're having a lovely day. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Rev Don, you can interact with me directly by typing your comments or your questions onto whatever platform you may be watching on. And they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion of spiritual contributions of the Correllian ancestors to the Correllian tradition. Yesterday we talked about the founder of the tradition, Caroline. Today we're going to talk about the second head of the tradition, Mable. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. It's good to see you. First, however, I want to mention that tonight will be the second class in Psychic 101 at Psychic Academy at 7 p.m. Central. And if you're interested in learning more about that, watch our various platforms. You can see it on my my Facebook page. You can see it on Sir Edward's Facebook page, and undoubtedly many other places. Hello to Mary in the chat room. Tonight, we will be talking about psychic energy and psychic hygiene, which is a very important subject, but we'll be talking about it in a fairly inclusive manner. So that will be tonight's subject. This weekend, on Saturday afternoon, will be my next Patreon seminar on seances, and it will be at 2 p.m. on Saturday, and it will deal with how to do seances and experiences in seances and everything about seances. So if you're interested in that, that is available, and you can attend that if you're a part of the seminar tier of my Patreon at revdonlewis.com, or you can get a ticket at Correllian Publishing. So those are some of the things going on immediately. And moving back to our subject, we were talking yesterday about Caroline. One of the reasons for having this conversation is I don't know that I've mentioned, I know that I've mentioned in several places, but I don't know how widely I've mentioned the different qualities of these different people and how they influenced who we became today. And so I wanted to revisit that. And also, and we've talked about this in different places, I wanted to revisit the fact that we don't just pass along knowledge, we increase it as we go. Each generation of Correllian leadership increased the knowledge they were passing on. And in some cases, added whole new focal points that were not there previously. Or at least new levels of expertise. And I wanted to talk about that. We were talking yesterday about Caroline and about whether certain things predate the founding of the tradition. I was always taught that they did. But the things that Caroline herself particularly was good at, such as mediumship, herbalism, psychic healing. I don't think I ever got to mention that she was also a reader. She read in the carnival that they ran for many years. Hello to Lynn in the chat room. Good to see you, Lynn. And all of these things are part of what she brought to the tradition, including a number of traditions of witchcraft in her ancestral past, and also what I've always understood as Aradian tradition coming down from Leland. So those things all go to Caroline. Now with Mable, well, you know, everyone is different. Everyone on a psychic path is going to have their strengths and their weaknesses. Caroline had 3 daughters. She had Dora, Dolly, and Mable. And only one of those 3 daughters outlived her only one of those three daughters had any children of her own. That was Mable. And Mable was the very last child that Caroline had. Whereas Dora was the first of her children to die. Dora died at the age of, I believe, 18 in 1898. And then Mable became a thing. She was born in 1899. So she never knew her eldest sister, though she was very close to Dolly. In fact, there are some wonderful photos of the two of them together. I've talked about them on the night of the Correllian Ancestors that show the two of them basically dancing together around 1918, give or take a year. And Dolly is wearing a very modern for that time pantsuit, which was very typical of her. But where Caroline was much more into hands-on things, and Mable certainly practiced many of those things as well. For example, she too was a reader at certain points in her life. But she was a lot more interested in the mechanics of things. And hello to Mary in the chat room. She was very concerned with issues of incarnation, reincarnation, the relationship to the soul, the chakras. I couldn't tell you with absolute certainty if Caroline ever worked with chakras. She certainly could have. That knowledge was out there. But it's Mable who really made that a big Correllian thing. And it's Mable who created many of our psychic exercises. Not all of them, but many of the basic ones go back to her. And she was influenced by a number of things that were popular at her time. And that is something that I think speaks to all of us. Really probably in any aspect of life, but in the metaphysical world, we tend to be influenced by the things that are popular when we're here. Some of us will be influenced by older things, others will never find those things. But the things that are popular when we're here tend to have an influence on us. And with Mable, writers like Alice Bailey, the works of groups like the Theosophy Society, these things had a lot of effect on her point of view, but they were very popular in her day. She also was heavily involved with spiritualism, and she was certainly an advanced medium. But as I say, her primary interest had to do with how the soul enters and interacts with this lifetime. And if she was particularly concerned with the theology of the creation of the world, for example, I've never heard it. But some of I actually knew Mable. Caroline was dead long before I was living. I've interacted with her as a spirit, but never with her physical form. But with Mable, our lives did overlap. And she was a huge influence on me, even though she died when I was quite young. And some of the earliest things I remember are her spiritual teachings. Although, granted, usually coming later from my mother, but there's some of the earliest things that I remember. And going back into those memories, one of the things my grandmother taught that was very unusual for the time is the idea that you don't get just one version of this life. You can have many. The multiverse, for want of a better way to put it, although I'm not aware of her having used that term. The way she put it was that when you have lived this life, if you're not satisfied with it, you can do another version of it. She thought of it, I believe, more in linear terms. I see the same process as being more or less simultaneous because that's more the thought of my generation. But that idea that life is not limited to one version, as a Correllian thought, definitely comes with Mable. And I heard that so early in life, I couldn't tell you when. I can remember a particular situation where I was having my hair cut. And I think I've mentioned that here on the right side of my head, there is now a white spot. You can't really see it at this angle. I could probably find it for you, but I don't see a need to do that. But there's a white spot here, and it's been a white spot since I was 18 years old. But before that, it was jet black. And even as a small child, that spot was very noticeable. And it was the subject of a lot of conversations when I was very young about what it meant. And everyone was certain it meant something. But part of that conversation, I remember being told that we pre-exist this life. And I remember seeing myself, because I could visualize very early, I saw myself as a baby in the web of the universe. So the term web of the universe is an old concept in the High Correll family. Hello to Lavola in the chat room. But that concept of how the soul is present before its birth, that was the subject of that conversation that led to that image in my mind. It wasn't just that the soul pre-existed life, but that in many cases, the soul is around what will become its parents long before it's born, and that it does play an active role in choosing that situation. And this is an idea that what I'm pretty certain have come from Mable. It's part of her particular wheelhouse. I'm not saying that Caroline didn't share some of those views, but Mable developed them much farther. And a lot of that deeper philosophical characterization that you find in Correllianism, to the best of my knowledge, comes from her. And this is part, I talked yesterday about how the ability to see the same thing in different ways is a fundamental part of Correllianism that comes from Caroline. Oh, and Mary says, have I mentioned I adore Mable? Well, thank you, Mary. I may throw out a couple of autobiographical pieces about her in a moment. With Mable, it's that deep look into why certain things work as they do, at a philosophical, theological level. As I say, she studied most of the writers of her day who worked in metaphysics and brought many of their ideas into Correllianism, and you'll still find them there. I've been told, actually, that the nature of the illustration ritual shows an influence of Kabbalah. I have never been aware of Kabbalah in Correllianism, but apparently it's been there and left behind certain signs. That would have probably been under Mable because Kabbalah was very popular and broadly studied at that time. And for her, it was very much those ideas of the 20s, the 30s, and moving into the 40s that really shaped her mind, her points of view, in addition to what she was raised with, all of which was still there and going forward. But she also introduced these other ideas. Her brother, her brother was a noted astrologer and introduced a lot of astrological ideas, a lot of astrological thought. Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill was an astrologer. He notably warned my parents that their charts were not compatible. He was totally right about that. So each person brought different things, and they all integrated. And one of the things about Correllianism that I hope will never change is that you are not a Correllianism who also studies Buddhism over here, or Kabbalah over there, or whatever. You are a Correllian who integrates this into your practice. It's not a separate part of your life. It's an integrated part of who you are as Correllian. I've met a lot of people who think they practice several different paths that never cross, and maybe for them they do. I don't understand that concept. In my mind, you're integrating this into who you are, and therefore the tradition you leave behind. Now, I mentioned I'd throw out a couple of autobiographical aspects of Mable, and maybe I'll throw out a couple of autobiographical aspects of Caroline as well that we didn't get to yesterday. But Mable was a flapper. She was a very beautiful woman. She was what would have been called an it girl at the time. If you don't know what the term it girl means, it's a term of the 1920s. Now, Lavola says, Reverend Don, I heard that Alexandrians are similar to Correllians. And are these related? Not to the best of my knowledge. I personally have never thought of them as being particularly similar, but maybe I wouldn't see it. The one thing we do have in common is that Alex Saunders was always clear, and Maxine Saunders has corroborated that he came from a family practicing hereditary techniques. Not necessarily the ones he passed on, because he was heavily influenced by the witchcraft of his time, but they were definitely practitioners. And I've read Maxine Saunders' descriptions of what that grandmother did, because she was still living. And they sound very much like what was going on in my own family. So in that sense, there may be some similar influences. Otherwise, I don't know. I have never been an Alexandrian. I've known many Alexandrians, and I have been to things. But I'm not aware. I mean, I'm sure that we have people in the Correllian tradition now who have Alexandrian initiations. In fact, I can even think of a few. But in the past, not to my knowledge. So there you go. But getting back to the idea of an it girl, this was a term from the 1920s. It was inspired by Eleanor Glynn. And I don't know if anyone watching this will know who Eleanor Glynn is, but she was a famous romantic, slightly erotic novelist of the early 20th century, who then became a prominent screenwriter in Hollywood. And it was a term that she coined for a magnetic personality. It's often interpreted as sexual appeal, but that isn't all she meant by it. She meant that kind of magnetic personality that draws people to them. Mable had that personality. And she was a very glamorous woman. If you notice, I love my jewelry. I've always dressed a certain way. A lot of the inspiration for that comes from Mable, although Caroline also, and her older daughters, all tended to be well-dressed. And there are reasons for that. There are a number of reasons, including self-respect in a world where they were not exactly equal, respectability politics, and also, I would like to think, because it's true for me, that the love of the art of putting that together. But Caroline, Mable rather, at her funeral, someone remarked to, or actually I believe it was after she had died, not at her funeral. At her funeral, someone remarked not how natural she looked in the casket, but how beautiful. But after her death, someone remarked about her to, in front of my mother, to another person, you remember Mable, she always dressed. And that says a lot about her. She had the trine, or no, rather the conjunction of Venus and Mars in her astrological chart. And in my favorite astrology book, which is Heaven Knows What by Grant Movie, he calls that the it aspect. And that kind of described her. And she led a very colorful life. She was married at different times to the Gin King of Vermilion County during Prohibition. She was married to a Swedish aristocrat. She was an independent career woman, a woman at other points in life. And she lived many of the fantasies of her generation. And the most interesting thing on the top of my head right now to say about her, one of the memories that I have is that every day when I was at her house, we would go walking. And there was this little house that we would usually stop at, and we would usually have our lunch there with the people who lived at this house, who were a man and a woman. And the woman had, I believe, white hair. Might have been gray, but I remember it as white. And years later, I mentioned this to my mother. And my mother had to think a minute to place who this couple could be. And then she realized it's not a couple and it wasn't a house. It was the control shack for the local train crossing. And the man was the crossing guard. I'm not sure what you properly call them, but he was there to make sure that everything worked. And the woman with him was actually his mother, because he was mentally challenged. He had been able to get this job, and my grandmother knew them from much of her life, and she would stop and have lunch with them, partly because they were quite poor. And on the premise of bringing things for herself, she would add to their lunch, which was a wonderful thing to do and very much like my grandmother. Now, Lavola asks, was she an artist? If she was, she left no artwork behind her. But she was certainly an artist in how she approached her life and things like how she presented herself. Now, my grandfather was a visual artist, and my father was a visual artist. My grandmother might have been. I don't know that she wasn't. But again, if she did visual artwork, well, oh, but she did. It's interesting when you start to think of things. My grandmother was a textile artist. She did a lot of hand embroidery, and those embroideries were as detailed as any picture that you might draw with a pen, and as skilled. So yes, she was an artist, but she was not like a pen and ink artist. She was a fabric and thread artist. One time some of those still existed. They might still, but yes, now that I think about it, she was an artist. Just not in the same way that I am, for example. So the visual arts are running all through the High Correll family. And I think that this is also connected to visualization. I cannot remember a time in my life when I could not visualize. And I'm hard, and I would have to go back to before I could use my hands to remember a time I did not do artwork. Which one influences the other, I don't know, but I think that there's probably some connection. I mentioned seeing visual images when I was a toddler, really. And they were as highly developed as anything I'd visualized today. My mother later took it upon herself to teach me to visualize in a more or less subtle sort of way. But I already knew. But I didn't necessarily know how to tell her at that age. And what I mean by she tried to start that teaching in a subtle way, I always had trouble falling asleep when I was young. I assume from being a Gemini. And her advice to me was to create stories in my head, make them as detailed as I could, and see them with all their visual details, which actually is a good way to create that skill of visualization. But in fact, I could already do that, but focusing on it that way was very helpful. And I would assume that's been there all along. Now, going back to Mable, we're nearly at the end of our half hour. There'll probably be more about her tomorrow, but tomorrow we'll be talking about my mother, Leveda. The other thing that perhaps I should mention, I mentioned earlier that she too was involved in the Spiritualist Church like her mother. She was also involved in the Universalist Church. She had some acquaintance with Italo Lawrence. I don't think her acquaintance with Italo Lawrence was anywhere near as close as Caroline's relationship with Lydia Beckett. But I could be wrong about that. And Italo Lawrence is more commonly known as Atzi Lawrence. And she is the co-founder of the Lawrence Museum of Magic and Witchcraft, which existed in Galveston, Indiana, for about 50 years, starting in 1939. But that those were some of the things in her life. Tomorrow we'll talk more. And for now, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. And again, I want to remind you that tonight will be the second class of Psychism 101 at Psychic Academy at 7 p.m. And that we have the Seance workshop coming this weekend. And I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank those who are here every day. I love to see you. I love to talk to you. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And let us take a moment now, as we do each day, for our closing prayer. Oh, and hello to Silva in the chat room. Good to see you, Silva. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to be with us and to guide us as we go forward. We ask you to remind us of the oneness of the world, the oneness of our physical world, and also of the spiritual world. And remind us also that if Gaia, the earth, arguably the universe, is an intelligence, then spirit also obviously is. And their interaction, like the interaction of our soul and our life, is vitally important to how things move forward. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. We know you're always with us. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. Oh, and hello to George in the chat room. It's good to see you. I thank you for your presence, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.